The skinny bear Dogman invited himself inside. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid in the 1990s, my father rented what he called a log cabin in the woods for our family to have a big Christmas gathering. It really was a 2-story house with a log facade on the outside that slept 8 adults comfortably inside. I think we brought cots, and I think there were 14 of us there. 6 adults and 8 kids, sleeping basically all over the place. My brother and I were looking forward to seeing our cousins, and it was exciting to find out that everyone who had been invited did indeed show up. It was even more exciting, but not in a very positive way, when we got an uninvited visitor that wasn't even a human being. My mother and her sister had gotten out to the rented house in the woods the night before the rest of us, and had set up the Christmas tree themselves. They also had started slow cooking various meats in the large oven before any of the rest of us started showing up. This place was fancier than our house, but it was way out there in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it felt like we were off the grid, but there was electricity, heat, hot and cold running water, so we were definitely on the grid. It was just a very dark and forested corner of the grid, way off the beaten path. I never saw any other families out there. It was only us in that house. I don't even remember seeing other houses there, but like I said, we weren't operating on generator power or anything like that, so we were a little bit of civilization way out in the woods. This story happened just after Christmas, actually, as we were spending something like 5 days there that year, due to how the calendar broke down for school and the time our parents could get off from their jobs. We were all inside with both of the women cooking. It started to get hot and sweaty in there. We hadn't noticed that the weather had warmed up a bit until it was uncomfortably hot in the house. So someone opened up the front and back doors in order to create a cross breeze and air it out for a few minutes to bring the temperature down. Well, that was all the time it took for this tall man covered in fur to walk right into the kitchen. My mother and her sisters screamed, and they ran out, and then the men ran in after them. And then the men screamed and backed out of the room as well. We all grabbed positions under, to the side, and around the adults, straining to get a view of what was going on in there. I got myself a pretty good angle, and I have to tell you I was extremely excited about what I was looking at. One of my dreams has always been to see a Bigfoot or a Yeti. Initially, that is what I thought I was seeing. The body didn't exactly look like a Bigfoot though, and I found this confusing. For one thing, the legs were wrong. An even bigger problem was that the feet were wrong. You can't be a Bigfoot if you haven't got big feet. And this particular creature had dog feet. They looked like werewolf legs or the hind legs of a canine, and I'd never seen Bigfoot legs depicted that way in any of the literature. I won't say I was an expert on the subject, but I was a kid who loved TV shows and books about Sasquatch. The most obvious difference between my idea of what a Bigfoot looked like versus this creature was the head. This being had dog ears up on top of his head, and his snout came outward like a dog or a wolf's nose does, or like a cat does, to be completely honest. It had a low forehead and did not appear to me to possess very much intelligence. This is why my cousins called it a Dogman, but why my father and uncles called it a skinny bear. We were all trying to find a context to fit this odd creature inside of. Well, what it lacked in intelligence, it made up for in hunger. The creature had walked into that kitchen and immediately began eating the big dinner that my mother and aunt had been preparing for us humans. The creature tore into the birds first, as they were roasting a couple or 3 chickens. I actually laughed at the sound it made when it realized how hot the birds were. It was like a comedy sound that Jim Carrey might have made in that situation. Nobody else besides me was finding any humor in any of this, since they, unlike me, were not morons. I had no concept of how much money was being slobbered over and ruined by the nasty bug-covered animal man. I just knew I was getting to see the greatest show on earth. So it was brown, and it was shaggy. It looked like it had never been groomed in its life. It panted like a dog and seemed pretty dim, but I wouldn't call it evil or anything like that. At least it didn't seem that way to me. It stood as tall as the adult men, and they were all, I guess, between 5'10" and 6'1" maybe. So it wasn't that tall, but it was bigger than the women and children. My father eventually passed on in 2019, but he lived long enough to see the rise in popularity of the Dogman. In fact, in the later days of his life, he used to talk to me a lot about how he wished he had known what that thing was when it came into the cabin. He told me he had recurring dreams about it, in which he was back there in that place, and the Dogman wandered in a second time. Each dream was about him catching the Monster Man, and knowing that he would be the first man to ever put a captive Dogman on display. Then Dad would wake up, realize it was a dream, and be filled with regret and longing for what might have been. He told me that he even dreamed that he had a time machine, and went back to that night when the Dogman wandered into the house, this time prepared and ready for the beast to arrive. The more Dad read about the Dogman, the more emotional pain he found himself in. He refused to attend meetings with other Dogman witnesses. He refused to go public. But on the other hand, he refused to drop it and let it go either. It tore him up that he missed such a good opportunity. But this was before Dogman was famous in Pennsylvania, and none of us had any idea that we were entertaining a legendary cryptid. We just thought we'd been invaded by a big old scavenger dog, and I suppose there's a lot of truth to that too. Now, I do not want to make it sound as though this was not a scary and upsetting experience for the adults and the kids, or at least the ones who had half a brain, but I was in neither of those categories at all. In the beginning of all this, I don't think I was ever so excited or happy. I was getting to see a cryptid man, even if it wasn't a Bigfoot. I had never known hunger as my parents had when they were starting out, so the idea of a big, upright walking dog eating our dinner was just comedy to me, like a pie-throwing fight in a Three Stooges movie. I was kind of an idiot, and I didn't know better than to laugh at what was happening. It all took a darker turn, though, when my Uncle Ralph put himself at risk by running into the kitchen and grabbing up food that the Dogman had not slobbered over yet, then hustling it out to the dining room. I mean, he was the only reason we all got to eat anything later on, to be honest. On Ralph's third or fourth trip back into that kitchen, though, he went to grab a cheesecake, and the Dogman at that same moment decided he might like to try some of that cheesecake. When Uncle Ralph got in the creature's way, got shoved. This was a casual kind of shove to the Dogman, but I don't suppose he really knew his own strength, as my uncle went skidding and tumbling across the room, clocked his head on the corner of a table, and was out like a light. That was the moment when everything stopped seeming funny. That was the instant when the panting dog, who wandered in from the cold, stopped seeming cute. That was when it shifted, even in my so-called mind, from an interesting thing that was happening to a dangerous situation that had better be handled quickly. We didn't know at the time that Uncle Ralph was going to be fine. We just knew that he was unconscious, and that it was the Dogman's fault. The mood shifted in that house to the point where even the Dogman noticed it. And as I mentioned earlier, the Dogman had no forehead. He looked uncomfortable and slowed down his eating to stare at us. I heard him growling, but my father pulled a rolling pin down off the wall and glared at the Dogman. My other still conscious Uncle Bernie moved into the kitchen as well, and the dogman's growling turned to a high-pitched whining sound as he seemed to be realizing that he was outnumbered. I think this was a young dogman. I don't think an adult would have wandered into a human settlement like that, except as some kind of last resort. This creature was not sick. This creature was not starving. It seemed very fit. It wandered into the house because it just didn't know any better. This had to have been a youngster or a teenager testing boundaries and experimenting with what he could get away with. That's how I see it now, looking back so many years later on the situation. At the time, he was bigger than I was, so I sort of saw him as an adult monster. I saw my cousins as adults too, just because they were 15 and 16, you know? So in retrospect, I think that was a younger dogman, not a fully grown one, who would have known better than to barge in like that. Well, anyway, once Uncle Ralph was down and out, my dad and Uncle Bernie got extremely serious. Dad banged the rolling pin hard against the wall, and I saw that dogman jump and flinch, just a little tiny bit. There was a moment where the beast looked like it was trying to think. Then its eyes flashed quickly around the room, as if taking a quick mental inventory, and it flew into action. The dogman reached out with his left arm and grabbed a hot chicken right out of its pan on top of the oven. When I say hot, I mean hot. And the dogman soon realized this too, as his paw-like hand, or hand-like paw, was burning up. His surprised reaction ended up flinging the bird out of the kitchen door into the snow. None of us knew if that was intentional or accidental, but that's what happened. Then, the dogman sort of moaned and waved his hand around in the air to cool it down. I definitely noticed that it had hands, not normal dog paws. Or I guess like I said before, they were kind of a mix between the two, but they worked like hands. His fingers were a bit short, but the long claws extending out of the ends made up for the difference. My dad took that moment to lose his patience and go ape on this dog-headed monkey man. He swung his wooden rolling pin at the dogman's burned hand. He swung at the creature's long dog snout. The animal was put on the defensive, working too hard to avoid getting wonked on the noggin to grab any more food or intimidate any more women or children. As the men advanced, the dogman backed up out of the kitchen. Eventually, it decided to cut its losses and dove out the same kitchen door it had come in through, grabbing that discarded chicken up out of the snow as it made good its escape. Uncle Ralph was revived, and he seemed fine. I guess nobody cared about concussions or whiplash or anything like that in those days, because I do not remember one single person discussing bringing Ralph to a hospital to make sure he was all right. I'll tell you what people were discussing, and that was leaving to go home. We had 2 more nights after that to our vacation, and none of us kids wanted to go to our normal, ordinary, boring lives 2 days early. We wanted to stay out in the woods with this badass, lunatic, dog-headed wolfman type of guy. What kid wouldn't? So anyway, it was the men calming the women down and convincing them that we didn't need to leave simply because a man-sized upright walking canine had eaten the dinner of 5 people and then run off. Since we now knew the creature was around, we only had to make sure not to leave any doors open and unguarded from then on. Problem solved. This was the collective reasoning of the men. Since there were 3 men in the cabin and only 1 out there, we had nothing to worry about as long as we stayed vigilant. And so it was agreed upon that we would try to stay the last 2.5 days. That night, just as I was falling asleep, my brother shook me back awake and motioned silently for me to look out the window on our side of the room. The dogman was out there, the one who had walked into our house earlier. I didn't notice him till later, though, because he was standing next to another dogman, that was almost twice as tall as he was. This one looked like Charles Atlas the bodybuilder covered in fur and enlarged to a size bigger than a grizzly bear. I mean, this looked like one of the Nephilim dressed as a furry in a dog suit. It was a brown furry Hulk with dog ears on top and glowing off-white eyes. Those eyes emitted soft beams almost like faint searchlights or spotlights. When it turned to look at our window, my brother and I ducked and saw the light from its eyes shine through the glass and land in a roughly cylindrical shape on the wall of the dark room. This was the single creepiest thing I ever saw. It was really like a scene from a horror film. Both of us were too scared to move for a long time. That having been said, neither of us told anyone about what we'd seen. If it got out that there was a creature almost twice as big as the one the man had chased off, I don't think we would have stayed there another 2 minutes, let alone 2 nights. So we kept our traps shut. You know, when I told this story to my wife, she felt that my brother and I put everyone's lives at risk by not alerting any adults to the existence of the larger Dogman. I do not see it that way. It was the forest. The forest has bears, cougars, probably snakes and spiders that bite. It's not going to become a safe place once the Dogman family leave. The point of going to the forest is to encounter different dangers from the ones you find in the city. I think Disney and Hallmark might have gotten everyone confused about nature. It is not governed by Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh. Instead, it's a whole lot of Stealin' and Robin, and it smells like poo. At any rate, I feel no guilt at all, because none of us saw anything else strange the rest of the week. We all continued to have ourselves a ball, in spite of the fact that the skinny bear Dogman invited himself inside. Friedrich and the Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, have you ever been looking through a relative's old family photo album and come upon a possibly momentous historical discovery? I think it might be possible that my mother's sister could be in possession of an actual photo of a Dogman or werewolf dating back to before the 20th century. When I was at my Aunt Edda's house recently, I was looking through her old photo albums. Some were her collections of pictures and news clippings from her life, but some were from previous generations and handed down to her. She also just loves photo albums in general, so some of them were nicked from older relatives just in case they decided not to leave them to Edda in their will. When I was going through the old photos, I came across one unlike any of the rest. It seemed to be very old, dating back to the 1800s possibly, and it depicted a man sitting and smiling at what appeared to me to be a Dogman. It looked posed, as if for publicity, and the man and the animal both were in front of a blank sheet, possibly inside the studio of an old professional photographer. This couldn't have been publicity material, though it didn't have anything printed on it. It was a very old photograph that appeared to have been hand-developed. It was fading a bit and was turning odd colors in places due to age, but the two figures in the image were both still clear and easy to see. One was a mustachioed man in some odd show business outfit, and the other was what sure looked to me like a Dogman. While the man smiled at the canine figure, the Dogman looked glassy-eyed and unhappy, almost as if it were going to cry. It has a long and somewhat broad nose, almost like a lion. Its hair is also bigger somehow around the head, just like a lion with its mane. The pointed ears up on top, and the general demeanor, however, gave me the strong and instant impression that this was a canine, and not a feline. That's Friedrich, Aunt Etta informed me. He was from a side of the family that was partial ancestor to my mother's side of the family. Etta said that he used to tour Eastern Europe playing in traveling circus sideshows with his trained werewolf. I asked her if it was real. What was it? The eyes looked so human on that werewolf in the photo. Could it have been a man wearing an animal's skin? It looked so real, but would it still look as real if it were in motion? It's the pained expression in the creature's eyes that make it seem so haunting to me. Etta said that she didn't know how they got the animal into the photographer's studio, but she speculated that it might be chained by the wrists and ankles, neither of which are visible in the image. Etta herself never doubted that it was a real animal, but her guess was that it was some now extinct species from Africa. Friedrich had been a big game hunter in Africa who exhibited rare creatures back in Eastern Europe before the 20th century, at least according to our family history. I have since Googled Friedrich and I have found nothing so far. It's so long ago that I would think most evidence of his life and career might have been destroyed in one of the 2 world wars that rocked that region a lifetime after the mysterious photograph was taken. Aunt Etta claims that my Aunt Margaret has an old circus poster that mentioned Friedrich and the werewolf, but that we'd have to wait for her to pass before we'd be able to see it. Aunt Margaret isn't talking to anyone on our side of the family due to some old feud that predates my birth. She's so old that she probably doesn't even remember what she's mad about anymore. I'd probably have better luck pretending to be a member of the press and asking Margaret for a peek at the photo that way instead. If you have any viewers in Eastern Europe, please ask them if they know any resources that might help me to find out some more about Friedrich and the werewolf. Whether you're cool or leading a putsch, you gotta give some credit to our EP Butch. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer Butch Rudrick, who is one of our channel members. He got to see our 2 secret Christmas Day anti-Christmas stories, which I believe have titles and thumbnails too harsh to show or even say on this channel. Here with the deets about how you too can see these new secret uncensored videos is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.